The morning the Homeowners Association shut off my electricity, it was 9 degrees outside, and Patricia Halloway told me through my own front door that a few cold nights would help me remember who was in charge. She was half right. I remembered a great many things that winter. None of them were what she had in mind. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 73 years old. I spent my younger years in places cold enough and mean enough that a Michigan January reads to me like a strongly worded letter. And I learned young that panic is a luxury reserved for people who have never actually been in trouble. I am not a lawyer. I am not an engineer. I worked with my hands my whole life. I keep every scrap of paper that ever crossed my mailbox, and I raised a daughter named Maggie who grew up to be an investigative reporter for a Detroit television station. Pat Halloway knew the first part. She had not thought carefully about the second, and that single failure of curiosity was going to cost her everything she had. It started, as these things do, with a fine I didn't owe. $200 for a non-compliant storm door that had hung on my unit unchanged since before Pat ever joined the board. I did the reasonable thing. I disputed it in writing, certified mail, keeping my copy, laying out plainly that a door predating the rule couldn't be retroactively illegal because that isn't enforcement, it's invention. I've been around long enough to know you never argue with these people out loud. You argue on paper, where it counts, and you keep the receipt. My daughter, when I told her, said the sentence that turned out to matter most in the whole business. Dad, save everything, every letter, every note, even the junk, especially the junk. I told her I already did. She knew that. She just wanted it on the record that she'd said it. Pat's response to a disputed fine was not to schedule a hearing. It was to send the association's property manager, a soft, nervous man named Doug, out to my unit to cut my power at the exterior panel, which, in a Michigan winter, means cutting the heat. The furnace, the blower, all of it, dead. She framed it as a utility suspension pending resolution of the delinquent balance, as though a homeowners association had any authority on God's earth to touch a man's electricity, which it does not, a fact whose full weight I was only beginning to understand. I came home to a cold, dark unit and a notice taped to my door, and I stood in my own frozen living room and felt something old and steady settle over me. The particular calm that arrives when a situation finally stops pretending to be reasonable. I did not call Pat and shout. I did what I was trained to do a lifetime ago. I assessed and I prepared. I dug my old military sleeping bag out of the closet, the one rated for weather that would kill a lesser bag, and the kerosene heater I keep for ice fishing, and I set myself up to be warm and stubborn for as long as it took. And then, because I have learned that the only difference between a victim and a witness is documentation, I started a log. A cheap spiral notebook and a thermometer, and every hour on the hour I wrote down the date, the time, and the temperature inside my home. 41 degrees at noon, 38 by evening, 33 the first morning, with frost blooming on the inside of my windows like something out of a nature film. I filled pages. It felt at the time like an old man's fussiness. It turned out to be the murder weapon, in the legal sense, aimed squarely back at the woman who had handed it to me. I went to see Pat once, and I went to her at my own doorstep, not hers, because I wanted her on my ground. She came because Pat could never resist an audience, even of one, and she stood on my frozen porch with the serene certainty of a woman who has never once lost. The power would come back, she said, the instant I paid what I owed and withdrew my frivolous dispute. When I told her, evenly, that she had no legal authority to shut off my utilities and that I was 73 years old in a 9-degree cold snap, she gave me a small smile and said the words that would eventually be played on 3 separate newscasts. "A couple cold nights," she said, "and you'll remember real quick who runs this community." She said it standing 18 inches from the little camera on my doorbell, the one I'd aimed at my own door out of nothing but habit, and which recorded her in crisp audio and clear daylight, telling an old man that freezing was a lesson. I thanked her for her time. Loud people who don't watch their mouths are a gift, if you have the patience to unwrap them slowly. That night I called Maggie and told her everything. and I heard her go quiet in the particular way she does when the reporter in her wakes up. But she didn't reach for a camera. She reached for facts, which is exactly why she's good at what she does. "We don't run a story about a mean HOA lady, Dad," she said. "That's nothing. We run a story about a pattern, or we don't run it at all. First we prove it's illegal, then we find out whether you're the only one." And so, between the two of us, me on the ground with my notebook and my sleeping bag, her with a newsroom and 15 years of sources, we started pulling the thread. The legal part came apart in an afternoon, because there was nothing to it. A homeowners association has no authority whatsoever to cut a member's electricity. That power belongs to a licensed utility, regulated by the State Public Service Commission, and even the utility can't shut off heat to an elderly resident in winter without clearing a gauntlet of protections built for exactly this situation. What Pat had done wasn't a gray area or an overreach. It was, potentially, the reckless endangerment of a vulnerable adult, and the cold clinical word for what a couple cold nights could do to a 73-year-old with my blood pressure was not lessen. My doctor, when I mentioned the indoor temperatures in passing at a checkup, stopped writing and looked at me hard. At my age, with my heart, prolonged cold exposure wasn't discomfort, he said. It was a genuine danger, and I needed to stop being a hero about it. I told him I'd take it under advisement. Then I drove home and wrote the time and the temperature in my notebook, because the danger, documented, was worth more to me than the danger merely survived. The second question, whether I was the only one, is where the whole thing turned from my problem into Pat Halloway's reckoning, because I wasn't the first, not close. Maggie's digging and my knocking on doors turned up a quiet, ugly history. For years, the Willow Creek Board under Pat had used fines, threats, and utility suspensions as a tool aimed with real precision at exactly one kind of resident: elderly people, living alone, on fixed incomes, in units the board would dearly love to turn over to buyers who'd pay the newer, higher assessments. Squeeze the old ones until they broke, until they sold cheap and left, and call it enforcement. One name kept surfacing: an 80-year-old woman named Ruth who'd lived 2 buildings over. The winter before, the board had pulled the identical trick on her over a disputed charge, and Ruth had spent 3 nights in a unit like a meat locker before a neighbor found her, and she landed in the hospital with hypothermia. She'd survived. She'd also, terrified, sold her unit and moved in with her son that spring, which had been precisely the point. Ruth was still alive, still sharp as a tack, and after I sat in her son's kitchen and told her what Pat had done to me, she was ready, more than ready, to speak on camera. Pat felt the ground shifting, the way a person always eventually does when the con they've run for years starts coming loose, and she got aggressive, which only ever helped me. My fines abruptly multiplied. A lien threat arrived by certified mail, the slow paperwork that ends, if you let it, with people losing their homes. She leaned on my neighbors to stop talking to that troublemaker, and a couple of them went cool on the road. And then she made the move that sealed it. She had Doug quietly generate paperwork dated to before the shutoff, recasting the whole thing as scheduled electrical maintenance on my unit, a clumsy little forgery meant to scrub the word suspension out of the record. It was the act of a woman who'd finally grasped that she was exposed and reached, far too late, for a cover story. I photographed it, added it to the pile, and kept writing temperatures. 29 degrees, one brutal morning, the coldest my little log ever recorded. I pulled on another sweater and outlasted it, because outlasting things is the one skill this life has never taken from me. Maggie built the story the right way, the slow way, the way that survives a lawyer's letter. She had my temperature log, hours upon hours of it in my own hand. She had the doorbell recording of Pat promising an old man a cold lesson. She had Ruth and Ruth's hospital records, and 2 more seniors who came forward the moment they understood they weren't alone in it. She had the state statute proving the association never had a shred of authority to touch anyone's power. And she had, because real journalism requires it, a formal written request for comment sent to Pat and the Willow Creek Board, which they answered through a lawyer, calling the inquiry harassment and demanding she stand down, a reply so arrogant it practically wrote itself into the closing seconds of the segment. Maggie filed a complaint with the State Public Service Commission and made certain Adult Protective Services and the county prosecutor had the whole file, so that whatever the cameras started, the law could be standing by to finish. Then she picked the day. They came with 3 trucks. Not just Maggie's station. 2 competitors had caught the scent by then, because a story about a board that freezes an old veteran and hospitalizes a grandmother is the kind of story that grows legs and sprints. They set up on the public sidewalk outside the Willow Creek Association office on a bright, bitter afternoon, and Maggie stood in front of a live camera and laid the whole thing out with the flat, devastating calm she got from her old man. The fine I never owed, the illegal shutoff, my log held up to the lens, page after page of a 73-year-old's home sliding toward freezing, while the association that did it called it routine maintenance. Ruth, dignified and unhurried, describing 3 nights in the cold and the hospital that followed. And then Pat Halloway, who has never in her life been able to resist an audience or surrender an ounce of control, came marching out of the office to put a stop to it, on live television, and began lecturing my daughter about private property and community standards in front of every rolling camera on that sidewalk. Maggie let her wind all the way down. Then she asked, mildly, whether Mrs. Halloway stood by her recorded statement that a couple cold nights would help a resident remember who ran the community. And she played it, right there, in the cold, bright air, in front of 3 cameras and a thickening knot of neighbors, Pat's own voice unspooling out of the little speaker for the whole county to hear. I have never watched a human face do what Pat's did in that moment, the dawning comprehension, live and unedited, that the lesson had found its way home and had her own name written across it. She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. And the silence did more damage than any answer could have. A woman 2 rows back in the crowd said, "You froze him on purpose." Not as a question, and it carried straight into every microphone on the block. It came down on Pat like a roof in a heavy snow. The station's phones lit up before the segment even ended. By that evening, the story had gone regional. By the next, it had gone national, in that hungry, unstoppable way these things do. HOA freezes elderly veteran, and there is no lawyer alive who can unring a bell like that. The State Public Service Commission opened a formal investigation into the illegal shutoffs. The prosecutor's office began looking hard at reckless endangerment, now that it had a documented pattern, a hospitalized victim, and a temperature log that read like a confession written in reverse. The board, scrambling to save its own skin, held an emergency meeting and pressured Pat into resigning before the week was out. The 2 members who'd signed off on the shutoffs went out the door behind her. Doug, the property manager, discovered a sudden and profound eagerness to cooperate with investigators rather than sink with the ship, and what he handed them finished the job. My fine evaporated, along with every lien they'd hung over every senior they'd squeezed. Ruth got an apology that meant nothing and a settlement that meant a good deal more. And the community, mortified into its senses, seated a new board that put in writing what never should have needed writing, that no one at Willow Creek would ever again lay a finger on a resident's heat. They turned my power back on 4 days after the cameras came. I stood in my kitchen and listened to the furnace kick on, that low, familiar rumble, the warmest sound in the whole world. I shut off the kerosene heater and let it tick as it cooled. Then I sat down at my table, opened my spiral notebook one last time, and wrote a final line beneath all those hours of cold. Power restored, 68 degrees, case closed. I rolled up the old military sleeping bag and set it back on the closet shelf, where it will wait for the next Michigan winter, one I intend to spend warm, by my own choice, on my own terms, the way a man is supposed to. Author's chair for a minute, stepping out of Walt's story, because this one is a lesson in how cruelty and arrogance manufacture their own evidence. Where did Pat go wrong? She treated an old man as a soft target and never once asked what he'd survived or who his family was, and the daughter she couldn't be bothered to think about ran the newsroom that buried her. She said the quiet part straight into a doorbell camera, converting enforcement into a recorded threat. She reached for a forged maintenance record instead of a lawyer, which only proved she knew she was guilty. And every hour Walt spent writing down the temperature turned her couple cold nights into a documented pattern of endangering a vulnerable man. The recording proved intent, the log proved harm, and Ruth proved it was a system. Practical takeaways. An HOA has zero authority to shut off your utilities. That power belongs to a regulated utility with special winter protections for the elderly and the vulnerable. Document everything in the moment, by hand if you must. A time-stamped log is devastating precisely because it's boring and true. And when a board controls every room in the building, take the fight to the one place it can never control: daylight. A question for you. If your HOA cut your heat in the dead of January to make you comply, would you have paid up just to get warm? Or grabbed a notebook and a thermometer and made them famous? Tell me below. I want to know how many of you keep the receipts.